June 1996. Game 6. NBA Finals. Shawn Kemp is 26 years old, going toe-to-toe with Michael Jordan on the biggest stage in basketball. He finishes the series averaging 23.3 points, 10 rebounds, shooting 55% from the field. The Finals MVP voting is so close that Kemp nearly becomes the second player in history to win that award from the losing team. Nearly. On the surface, this looks like the beginning of a dynasty, a young superstar at his peak, a $107 million contract waiting on the other side. But 9 years later, at 1 o'clock in the morning, police pull over a truck in a quiet suburb north of Seattle. Inside, cocaine, marijuana, a loaded 9mm handgun. The man in that truck was the same man who nearly won Finals MVP. This is the story of what happened in between. Elkhart, Indiana, 1969. It's not a city that produces NBA superstars. It's a mid-sized Rust Belt town in the northern part of the state. The kind of place where factory work defines a generation, where Friday night high school basketball is the closest thing to a religion, and where the options for a kid without money are narrow enough to count on one hand. Shawn Travis Kemp was born into that world on November 26, 1969. He grew up in a single-parent household, no father in the picture, no safety net, just his mother, the neighborhood, and a basketball. What happened next wasn't the product of a system. There was no elite training facility, no AAU pipeline grooming him for the league, no mentor mapping out his future. Kemp developed his game the way kids in Elkhart did on outdoor courts, against older players, through raw repetition and the kind of hunger that doesn't come from ambition alone. It comes from necessity. By the time he reached Concord High School, it was obvious to everyone watching that something different was happening. Kemp became the school's all-time leading scorer. He led Concord to a state championship at the prestigious B/C All-Star Camp, the proving ground where the nation's best high school prospects sized each other up. Kemp walked in on his first day and outplayed the highly regarded Terry Mills, a player everyone had already anointed as a future pro. He was named a McDonald's All-American, the best of the best. College scouts circled. The University of Kentucky came calling, one of the most storied programs in the country. Kemp enrolled in 1988. He never played a single game. In November of that year, Kemp was accused of pawning 2 gold chains that had been reported stolen from his teammate, Shawn Sutton, the son of Kentucky's head coach, Eddie Sutton. No charges were ever filed. Shawn Sutton did not press the matter, but the damage was done. Kemp's name was attached to a cloud of suspicion inside a program run by the very man whose family was involved. He left Kentucky. Here's what matters about that moment. Not whether Kemp did it or didn't do it, but what it revealed. When things fell apart, there was no institution standing beside him, no one to navigate the politics, no one to manage the optics, no one to protect a teenager who had traveled far from home and found himself suddenly unwelcome. He transferred to Trinity Valley Community College in Texas, spent a semester there without playing a single game, and made a decision that would define everything that followed. At 19 years old, Shawn Kemp declared himself eligible for the NBA draft. No college degree, no agent experience, no financial advisor, no framework for what it meant to go from nothing to everything overnight. His high school coach, Jim Hahn, saw it coming and worried about exactly that. To have Shawn in a college environment without basketball, the one thing he loves, was a big mistake, Hahn said. The coach even considered advising Kemp to go straight to the pros from high school, before stopping himself because so few players had ever done it. Hahn understood something fundamental. Basketball was the structure around which Shawn Kemp's entire life was organized. Remove it or even loosen it, and what was left to hold everything together? The Seattle Supersonics selected Kemp 17th overall in the 1989 NBA draft. 3 weeks before his 20th birthday, he made his NBA debut, the youngest player in the entire league. The crowd roared, the cameras flashed, the money was coming. But here's what nobody asked out loud. What does a 19-year-old kid from Elkhart, with no college education, no family wealth, and no institutional support, actually do when the world hands him everything at once? The NBA didn't ask that question. Nobody did. And that silence, that collective failure to ask the obvious question, would echo through everything that came after. Seattle loved Shawn Kemp in a way that cities rarely love athletes. Not just because he was good, because he was electric, because every time he caught a lob near the rim, every time he rose above a defender and slammed the ball through the net with both hands, the entire arena held its breath for half a second, then erupted. It wasn't basketball, it was theater. It was something people drove across the city to witness in person because they didn't fully trust that television could capture it. Broadcaster Kevin Calabro gave him the nickname, the Rain Man. A play on the Seattle rain, a nod to the way Kemp dominated everything around him when he was locked in. The name stuck immediately, the way only the perfect names do. Kemp arrived in the NBA as a raw teenager and spent his first 2 seasons learning, watching, getting minutes off the bench. But by 1991 to 92, the starting lineup was his. And once it was, the league started paying attention. What made him special wasn't just athleticism, though the athleticism was otherworldly. It was the combination. A 6'10" power forward with the vertical explosion of a shooting guard, the strength to bully centers in the post, and a mid-range game that defenses could never fully account for. He was a mismatch problem before the NBA had language for mismatch problems. But the thing that truly made the Sonics dangerous was what happened when Kemp and Gary Payton shared the court. The pick and roll between those two became one of the most lethal weapons of the decade. Payton, quick, predatory, relentlessly aggressive, would drive baseline and find Kemp rolling toward the basket at precisely the right moment, again and again, until opposing coaches ran out of answers. They didn't just play well together, they understood each other. 2 kids who had both grown up with something to prove, now proving it in front of the whole country. By 1995 to 96, it all came together. The Seattle Supersonics finished that season with 64 wins, a franchise record. Kemp averaged 19.6 points and 11.4 rebounds per game. He made the All-Star team for the 5th time. He was named to the All-NBA second team. He was, by every measurable standard, one of the 5 best players on the planet. Then came the NBA Finals. Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls had just finished the greatest regular season in NBA history, 72 wins. They were the prohibitive favorites. Most analysts didn't even frame it as a series. It was a coronation, they said, a formality. Seattle did not get the memo. Kemp and Payton pushed the Bulls to 6 games. In those 6 games, Kemp posted 23.3 points per game, shooting 55% from the field, pulling down 10 rebounds a night. He guarded Scottie Pippen. He attacked the paint against one of the greatest defensive teams ever assembled. He refused to let the moment be bigger than him. The Sonics lost. But Kemp's performance was so extraordinary that Finals MVP voting came down to the wire, and Kemp nearly became only the 2nd player in history to win the award from the losing side. Nearly. It was the highest point of his career, and from the outside, everything looked like it was just beginning. What the cameras didn't show, what the highlight reels carefully edited out, was that even during those finals, the pressure elsewhere in Kemp's life was already building. Paternity suits had begun to surface. By 1996, Kemp was reportedly supporting multiple children by multiple women, a fact that was beginning to circulate in NBA circles, even if the general public hadn't fully caught up yet. The financial obligations were real. The emotional weight was real. And Kemp, who had never been taught to compartmentalize, who had never had anyone sit him down and explain how to manage the intersection of fame and fatherhood and money, was carrying all of it quietly. There was something else. Under the league's collective bargaining agreement, the Sonics were locked into Kemp's existing contract and couldn't renegotiate. Kemp looked around the locker room, saw teammates earning more than him, felt the gap between what he was producing and what he was being paid, and grew quietly resentful. He complained. He pushed. The system didn't move. By 1997, he formally requested a trade. The Sonics obliged. In a blockbuster three-team deal, Shawn Kemp was shipped to the Cleveland Cavaliers. In exchange, he received what he had been asking for, a 7-year contract worth $107 million, one of the largest deals in NBA history at the time. Seattle waved goodbye to its icon, and Kemp flew to Cleveland to a new city, a new team, a new chapter carrying everything he had never learned to put down. $107 million in the bank, 7 children in the background, and not a single person in his orbit whose job it was to ask the question that still hadn't been asked. Are you okay? $107 million sounds like freedom. In 1997, it was the kind of number that ended conversations. The kind of number that made people assume every problem was solved, every worry was buried, every question about the future was permanently answered. Shawn Kemp had made it. Not just to the NBA, but to the very top of it. What that number didn't show was the math underneath it. By the time Kemp signed that contract, he was already supporting multiple children across multiple households. Court documents and a 1998 Sports Illustrated investigation confirmed what had been quietly circulating in NBA circles for months. Kemp had fathered 7 children by 6 different women, all by the age of 28. 7 children, 6 women. One man who had grown up without a father himself, now trying to figure out, without a blueprint, without a counselor, without anyone asking the hard questions, what it meant to be present for all of them. The media had a field day. David Letterman made jokes. Jay Leno made jokes. Sports radio made jokes. Shawn Kemp became a punchline in the late-night rotation, not a human being navigating an impossible situation, but a tagline, a cautionary tale delivered with a smirk. The coverage was relentless and almost entirely surface level. Here is a rich athlete who cannot keep his life together. Laugh. What nobody reported was the financial architecture collapsing underneath the headline. Child support for 7 children, spread across multiple states, compounded over years, doesn't leave $107 million untouched. It carves into it, slowly and consistently, in ways that are invisible to the public, but suffocating to the person writing the checks. Add to that the informal obligations the extended family members, the childhood friends who suddenly needed help, the entourage that had formed around him the moment the contract was signed, and the actual number available to Kemp was a fraction of what his name suggested. The NBA in 1997 had no mandatory financial literacy program, no required counseling, no structured transition support for players navigating sudden wealth. What it had was a contract and a press conference. The rest was Kemp's problem. Charlotte Osuna, the mother of Kemp's daughter Dominique, told Sports Illustrated that Kemp had personally disclosed to her the names of at least 5 other mothers of his children. She also said something that the punchline coverage consistently ignored, that Kemp was, in her words, an exceptional father to their daughter. He loves her, he sees her, he takes care of her, she said. That detail matters, because it complicates the easy narrative. This wasn't a man who didn't care. This was a man who cared too much, who tried to be present everywhere, for everyone, simultaneously without the emotional infrastructure to sustain it. And then the lockout happened. In 1998, A labor dispute between the NBA and its players' union wiped out the first half of the season. For most players, it was an unwanted vacation. For Kemp, already under financial pressure, already carrying private stress that had no outlet, it became something else entirely. He stopped training. He stopped monitoring what he ate. He stopped doing the things that had kept his body functioning at an elite level for 9 consecutive years. When training camp finally opened for the compressed 50-game season, Kemp showed up at 315 pounds. He had been 280 pounds the season before. 35 pounds in one off-season. His coach in Cleveland, Mike Fratello, pulled him aside and asked directly how it had happened. Kemp's answer was honest in a way that should have alarmed everyone in that room. "Coach," he said, "I didn't think we were coming back." 5 words, and underneath them, everything. A man who didn't think the season was returning, who, on some level, may not have been sure he was returning, and responded by letting go. Of the discipline. Of the structure. Of the one thing that had organized his entire existence since childhood. The media covered the weight gain as comedy. Fratello covered it as a conditioning issue. Nobody covered it as a warning sign from someone who was drowning. The 50-game season was brutal. Games stacked back-to-back, travel relentless, recovery time almost non-existent. Kemp played through it. He averaged 17.8 points and 3 rebounds. Made the All-Star game for a 6th and final time. On the surface, the numbers still held, but the body remembers everything. 35 extra pounds don't disappear in one compressed season. They stay in the knees, in the ankles, in the way a man moves at 31 versus 26. And they signal something deeper, that the engine which had run so clean for so long was beginning to overheat. Cleveland saw the numbers and saw a player who still produced. What they didn't see, what nobody was looking for, was a man quietly disappearing inside a life that had grown too heavy to carry alone. The $107 million was real. The 7 children were real. The pressure was real. And the silence around all of it was the most dangerous thing of all. Portland was supposed to be a reset. The Trailblazers had just come off a heartbreaking Western Conference Finals collapse against the Lakers in 2000, up by 15 points in the 4th quarter of Game 7, then somehow losing. They were a team on the edge of a championship window, desperate for one more piece to push them over. On paper, Shawn Kemp, a former 6-time All-Star, still only 30 years old, looked like that piece. The trade was made. The jersey was issued. The press conference was held. What arrived in Portland was not the Rain Man. What arrived was a man whose body had been carrying too much weight for too long, literally and otherwise. Kemp appeared out of shape from his first days with the team, struggling through practices that would have been routine 3 years earlier. The explosiveness that had defined him, the vertical that made arenas gasp, the first step that beat every defender in the league, had eroded in ways that conditioning alone couldn't explain. His numbers reflected it. In Portland, Kemp averaged 6.5 points and 3.8 rebounds in just 16.6 minutes per game. For context, in Seattle, he had averaged nearly 20 points a night. In Cleveland, still 17. Now, 6 points, 16 minutes. A reserve role on a team that had traded for him to be a difference maker. The coaches noticed. The front office noticed. Teammates noticed. But here's what most coverage of this era missed. Kemp noticed too. He was not oblivious. He was not in denial about what was happening to his body or his career. He was a man watching himself come apart in slow motion, unable to stop it, without the tools to address the root of what was wrong. And the root had never been basketball. Midway through the 2001 season, Shawn Kemp did something that almost no professional athlete of his stature had ever done publicly. He checked himself into a drug treatment facility. Voluntarily. In the middle of a season. While under contract. While the cameras were watching. "I had some issues to deal with," Kemp said afterward. He was careful with his words, guarded in the way people are when they've been burned by honesty before. But the acknowledgement was there. Cocaine. Alcohol. A lifestyle that had accelerated beyond what he could manage in a world that had never once asked him to slow down. The courage it took to make that admission publicly as a black man in professional sports in 2001, in an era when mental health and addiction were discussed in locker rooms only in whispers, deserves to be stated plainly. He asked for help. That is not weakness. That is one of the hardest things a person can do. The Trailblazers responded by waiving him. Kemp agreed to a restructured contract and forfeited $25 million of the $46.5 million still owed to him. The team moved on. The league moved on. The story became a footnote. Former star leaves for rehab, never returns to form. But let's break down who actually failed Shawn Kemp in Portland. The team acquired a player with documented conditioning issues and a growing personal crisis, handed him a roster spot without a structured support plan, and cut him loose the moment the situation became inconvenient. The league had no mandatory mental health resources, no addiction counseling infrastructure, no mechanism to catch a player in free fall before he hit the ground. The NBA's drug program existed to punish, not to prevent. The entourage, the friends, the associates, the people who had surrounded Kemp since the Seattle years had every incentive to keep the money flowing and no incentive to tell him anything he didn't want to hear. Nobody in that circle was going to be the one to say, "You need to stop." And the media, which had spent years turning Kemp's personal life into late-night comedy, had already decided who he was. The narrative was set. The punchline was written. There was no appetite for complexity. After Portland, Kemp signed a one-year deal with the Orlando Magic for the 2002-03 season. He played 79 games, the most he'd played in years. He averaged 6.8 points and 5.7 rebounds. Serviceable, unremarkable. A ghost of the player who had nearly won Finals MVP 6 years earlier. At the end of that season, the Magic did not renew his contract. No other NBA team called. At 33 years old, Shawn Kemp's career was over. Not with a ceremony, not with a tribute video, not with a farewell tour. It ended the way careers end for players the league has finished with, quietly, with a non-renewed contract and the sudden absence of a phone that used to ring constantly. He had entered the NBA at 19 with nothing but talent. He was leaving it at 33 with a fraction of what he had earned, 7 children depending on him, a body that had broken down a decade too early, and an addiction that rehab had addressed but not erased. The lights went out, and now came the part no one talks about. The years after the arena goes dark, when the crowd is gone, and a man has to figure out who he is without the one thing that defined him, since he was a child on an outdoor court in Elkhart, Indiana. The NBA doesn't prepare you for silence. For 14 years, Shawn Kemp's life had a structure that required nothing from him except to show up and perform. Schedules were made for him. Travel was arranged for him. Meals, hotels, practice times, game days, all of it organized by an institution that needed him functional and on the court. Basketball was not just his career, it was his calendar, his identity, the architecture holding everything else upright. When it ended in 2003, all of that disappeared overnight. What remained was a man in his early 30s, with no degree, no second career waiting, 7 children in multiple households, an addiction that had been addressed in rehab but not resolved, and the particular psychological vertigo that comes from being extraordinary at one thing your entire life and then having that thing taken away. He tried to get it back. In early 2005, reports surfaced that Kemp had been working out in Houston, trimming his weight, attempting to demonstrate to NBA front offices that the body was still viable. He made noise about a comeback. Avery Johnson, then coaching the Dallas Mavericks, a former Supersonics teammate who knew firsthand what Kemp was capable of, scheduled a personal workout in Houston. Kemp didn't show up. No explanation was given publicly. The Mavericks moved on. The window closed. 3 months later, on April 4, 2005, at 1 o'clock in the morning, a police officer in Shoreline, Washington, a quiet suburb north of Seattle, noticed a strong smell of marijuana coming from a parked Chevrolet pickup truck. He approached. He searched. Inside the vehicle, approximately 60 grams of marijuana, 2 grams of cocaine, a stun gun, and a loaded 9mm handgun registered to Kemp. He was arrested and booked for investigation of drug possession. Kemp denied using the drugs. He said they belonged to a friend. He pleaded guilty regardless and received 5 days of electronic home monitoring, 1 year of probation, and a $440 fine. In an interview with the Seattle Times shortly after the arrest, Kemp said something that stayed with the reporters who covered it. "I don't think it's going to hurt me on playing," he said, "but from the fan standpoint, it definitely hurts me. People are tired of hearing about this stuff. I'm tired of hearing about it, man." That last sentence deserves to sit for a moment. I'm tired of hearing about it. Not a man who didn't understand the gravity of his situation. A man who was exhausted by it, by the arrests, by the headlines, by the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. He then spun the arrest into motivation for his comeback. "I was glad that happened," he said, "because it really made me focus more." Whether he believed that or was simply performing optimism for an audience, only Kemp knows. 14 months later, on July 21, 2006, a deputy in Houston pulled over a car for driving without a license plate. The deputy smelled marijuana. He searched the vehicle. Kemp was charged with misdemeanor marijuana possession and released on a $500 bond. The message boards on Kemp's official website filled within hours. Posts titled, "I can't believe it. Very sad. No more NBA for you." A comeback attempt with the Denver Nuggets evaporated. Reports of interest from the Chicago Bulls surfaced, then disappeared when Kemp missed another workout. The pattern had become unmistakable. Opportunity would materialize, and something the addiction, the weight, the psychological burden of trying to recapture something that was gone would cause it to slip away. There was one final attempt. Kemp signed a contract with a professional team in Italy. He flew overseas. He played 3 preseason games. Then Hurricane Ike made landfall in Texas, threatening his home in Houston. Kemp flew back to the United States to check on his property. He never returned to Italy. And that was it. Not a dramatic ending. Not a press conference or a farewell speech. Just a man who flew home during a storm and never booked the return flight. The years that followed were quieter and, in their own way, more revealing. Kemp opened a sports bar in Seattle's uptown neighborhood called Oscar's Kitchen. It closed in 2015 when the rent became too high. In 2020, he opened Shawn Kemp's Cannabis, a dispensary in the Belltown neighborhood, with former teammate Gary Payton at the grand opening. It is, by all accounts, still operating. His son, Shawn Kemp Jr., played basketball at the University of Washington. Another son, Jamon, played at Southeastern Louisiana University and pursued a career in the G League. The game that had consumed his father's life had passed to the next generation cleaner, with the benefit of everything the father had learned the hard way. Then came March 8, 2023. According to court records and statements from Kemp's attorney, Someone had stolen a cell phone from Kemp's vehicle earlier that week. Kemp tracked the device using a location app to a parking lot in Tacoma. He drove there to retrieve his property. When he approached the vehicle, a Toyota 4Runner, someone inside fired at him first. Kemp fired back. Police arrived and arrested him for drive-by shooting. He was 53 years old. Prosecutors initially declined to charge him, citing the need for further investigation. The following month, he was charged with first-degree assault. In May 2025, Kemp accepted a plea deal, the charge reduced to second-degree assault. His attorney's version of events, stolen property, a confrontation, self-defense, remains the only detailed account on record. What is confirmed through court documents is that shots were fired, that Kemp was present, and that he ultimately pleaded guilty to a reduced charge. The Rain Man, at 53, was still in the storm. So what is the dark spiral of Shawn Kemp, really? It's easy to answer that question the lazy way. A superstar who squandered $100 million. 7 kids he couldn't afford. Cocaine in a parked truck at 1 in the morning. A shooting in a mall parking lot at 53. The story writes itself, and the late-night hosts already wrote it, 30 years ago, when the punchlines were easier than the truth. But here is what the punchlines never accounted for. Shawn Kemp entered the most powerful sports league in the world at 19 years old, younger than most college sophomores, with no degree, no financial guidance, no mental health support, and no one whose job it was to ask whether he was okay. The NBA handed him a jersey, a schedule, and eventually $107 million, and considered its obligations fulfilled. What it never gave him was the infrastructure to survive his own life. The 7 children were not the cause of his collapse. They were the visible pressure point of a man who had never been taught to build boundaries, who had grown up without a father, and was now trying imperfectly, expensively, across multiple states and households, to be present for children in ways no one had ever been present for him. Charlotte Osuna, the mother of one of his daughters, said he was an exceptional father. That detail never made it into the Letterman monologue. The weight gain was not laziness. The missed workouts were not indifference. The drugs were not stupidity. They were the symptoms of someone drowning in silence in a culture that celebrated what he could do on a court and had no language for what was happening inside him off it. The NBA has changed since 1989. There are financial counseling requirements now, mental health resources, player programs designed to address exactly the kind of collapse that consumed Shawn Kemp's post-peak years. Those changes did not come from nowhere. They came, in part, from watching what happened to players like Kemp, and finally, belatedly, deciding that handing a teenager $107 million without a single support structure was not enough. Kemp is 55 years old now. He runs a cannabis dispensary in Seattle. His sons played college basketball. The storm hasn't fully passed the 2023 shooting, the 2025 plea deal, the ongoing complexity of a life lived loudly and painfully in public. But he is still here, still standing in the city that once called him its own, the Rain Man. The name Kevin Calabro gave him in a moment of pure joy, watching a 22-year-old defy gravity above the rim. It turned out to be more accurate than anyone intended. Because the rain in Seattle doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with thunder or spectacle. It comes quietly, persistently, for a very long time. And sometimes, no one thinks to hand you an umbrella.